In this video, I'll review how to animate sprite sheets with pure CSS. We'll also explore tying the animation timeline to the scroll bar to create scroll-based animations like this one. You'll notice as I scroll the page, the little robot sprite is animating back and forth. And so it's kind of fun to do that. I also have one that's just playing independently. So this is an example of what we'll make. It requires no JavaScript. It's pure CSS. It's lots of fun. Let's get started with it. So really the harder part of this is actually creating your sprite sheet animation. And so I leveraged Adobe Animate to create this robot sprite. It consists of 8 frames, and each of these frames is equidistant from one another. They all have an equal width of 130 pixels. And that's going to be really important for what we're making here for this CSS animation to be simple and to work properly here. Once you have your sprite sheet, you don't actually have to have it on the screen. I'm going to hide that by commenting out this line of code. What we're going to do though is actually see one of the frames at a time. So we're going to put this as a background image within some kind of container box. I'll just use a div, for example. I'll leave that up there so we can have a frame of reference, but what I'm going to do is have a div and I'm going to give it a class of sprite. And I don't have to really have any content in there, but then I need to turn to my style sheet and reference that div with the class of sprite, and I want to give it a background image. So the background image for this is going to be the robot sprite PNG that I'm using. So we'll put that in and we'll have a background image there. Now we're not seeing anything show up yet because I don't have any width and height, and I happen to know that the frames that I created this sprite sheet have a width of 130 and a height of 204 pixels. So once I put that in, there's our div with the background image. And basically what we can do is animate that background through background position. So as an example here, I know that each of these is 130 pixels, that they separate from each other by 130 pixels. So if I type to 130 pixels in here, you'll notice that this actually goes to a new position. And every time I have another 130 pixels, we could actually go to a different position within the sprite sheet. So when I start at 0, obviously I'm actually going to be on the same first frame here, but every 130 pixels I'm moving to a different frame. So knowing that, we can animate that. And so let's go ahead and just jump into the animation piece for this. So what I want to do is have an @keyframes animation for my sprite. So I'm going to go ahead and call this @keyframes, and I'll just name this sprite. And what we'll do is have a 0%. So we're going to have this start with a background position here of what I'll do is just say 0%, 0%. So that's going to be that top left corner basically. Then at our full, the to side of our animation at 100%, we want the background position of our sprite, in that case, to be 100% of the way in, and 0%. I'm not going up and down, just sort of vertically here, so I'll have 0% on the X and Y. So for that sprite, we'll move the background position over time. So horizontally, it's going to move from 0 to 100% of the image. If we take a look at what that would look like once I add an animation to this and I reference the sprite and I give it some kind of timeline, let's say I say 1 second, you'll notice that it animated across the entire thing. Now I could make that infinite where it just keeps animating over and over again, but there's obviously some problems with this. Let's make this slower so we can kind of see what's happening too. So I'll make it 3 seconds, and you'll see that it's just animating across this whole timeline. It has some default easing in it that I won't want as part of this. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we'll have sort of a linear animation, and we can see how we're animating that background. Now, the problem with this is that it's all just moving left to right. And what I really want to do is just see one frame at a time. And so instead of actually even having a linear movement, I can do this in steps. And so what I'm going to do is choose steps, and we can put in the number of steps that we want. And in this case, it's going to be one less than the number of frames that I have, because we'll sort of start here, and then step 1 will be this guy, step 2, step 3, step 4. So I'm going to say that I wanted 7 steps. And as soon as I put that in, you can see that it's actually animating, and instead of going across the page, it's stepping through the animation, showing us each of our frames. So that's exactly what I want. I just need to sort of speed this up to a speed that seems more natural for that robot. And something like this, maybe about 1 second, or maybe 0.75 might be a little snappier, where the robot is kind of doing this sort of moonwalk across the screen. So pretty fun. We're already animating our sprite sheet. If I actually wanted this to move, I could do that as well. And what I might do is actually define a second animation for that. So I'm going to add another at keyframes animation for the movement part. And that's partly because I probably want the movement to take a different amount of time than the actual cycling of the animation. And in order to sort of have those with a different timeline, I'm going to go ahead and just create a separate at keyframes animation, rather than maybe translating the object within the sprite animation. So at 0%, I'm going to have a transform on this where I'll translate on the X. So I want this moving horizontally, and we're going to start it just at 0 pixels. In other words, we're not really going to move it from its current position to begin. Then what we'll do is we'll translate that at 100% to a transform of translate on X, and I'm going to move it down the screen. So let's say 1,000 pixels, and you can choose kind of any value based on your screen size. I could also actually do this based on like the viewport width or something like that, if I wanted it to always go all the way across or something. But I'll go ahead and translate it there. Then what we'll do is we'll add in a comma to our animation, where we're going to also add the move animation to this. We can give it like a timeline. Maybe it takes it 3 seconds or so to go across the screen. And you'll see that now that's moved across the screen and it's easing. I actually don't want it easing because robots move in a little more linear way. And what I might want this to do is kind of alternate back and forth, just so I can kind of see what's happening with it. Or I could move it over there and have things stop afterwards or whatever, but there we go. So we can kind of see how that might work. And then I might have an iteration count here where that could take a certain number of times. We'll have it alternate, where it will go backwards and then it will go forwards. So there we go. We're animating across the screen, pretty fun. Except what I really wanted to do was tie this animation to the timeline itself. And so that's our next step here, is let's go ahead and tie this to the timeline. So to tie this to the timeline, we're going to add the animation timeline here of animation timeline, and we'll say scroll. And this is a newer feature of CSS, and it's supported in Chrome and Edge, and there's a polyfill that you could add for Firefox to make this work. But with animation timeline scroll, what we're going to do is tie the scroll bar to our animation. And right now I don't have any scrolling, so I'm going to have to add a few things to this to make this work. What I might do is add just a little bit of content to this. I'll have an H1 called CSS Sprite Walk, and I'll throw that in there, and then I'll go ahead and have some paragraphs. Let's say I'm going to have maybe just like 10 paragraphs with some lorem ipsum in each of them. And so I'll have a bunch of content there so that I have a scrolling page. And you can see that at this point, and I need to, we could actually scroll our timeline. We can see that there's some animation happening back and forth based on that scroll position. Now, this isn't exactly what I want yet, and part of the reason for that is I need to make sure that I change my animation here. So I'm going to comment that particular line out and make it better for the actual timeline. So I still need to target my animation, but I'm going to rewrite this, and instead of 0.75 seconds here, I'm going to use 0.1 milliseconds, which would allow this to be a little bit more cross-compatible with the Firefox polyfill and fix. If you, a lot of times with timeline animations, you might just have like an auto time. And really, time doesn't make sense. We're tying the time to the scroll position, but by having 0.1, we're going to have a little bit more cross-compatibility there. I still want my steps here to be 7 as we go across, and I could also potentially have an iteration count. We can talk a little bit about that, but depending on how we want this to move, we might have like an iteration count. I still want this to move as well, so I'm going to call the other animation as well. The move animation, again, I'm just going to have that at 0.1 milliseconds, and I want that linear. And so you'll see that as I scroll this here, we're going to be moving sort of back and forth potentially for our content. Now this isn't quite working yet, and part of the reason that's not working, we can see that it's moving across the page as we scroll down, but it's not actually animating the steps. And part of that is that we need an iteration count at least of more than 1. So let's say I had an iteration count of 2. You'll start to see that this does change. But it changes like kind of as we're moving across the page. It's a little hard to see, and so what I think I'll do with this is also like fix it to the bottom. So let's go ahead and say that our position here is going to be fixed, and we'll say that it's going to be on the bottom. Let's say just right on the bottom of our timeline, so 0 pixels on the bottom. I might start just a little bit in from the left. Let's say 50 pixels in from the left. And we're kind of right on top of the text there, which is fine. But as I scroll here now, you can kind of see that robot, and it's changing. It's just sort of hard it's going kind of slow as we move back and forth. But the greater number of iterations I might make. So if I have a single iteration, it's only sort of as we go through our timeline, it's playing each of these frames, but like, you know, you have to be at like 12% in to get to the second frame, and then it will change, right? And so as we're scrolling, we're barely getting some changes. The more iterations that we say have to happen as we scroll down the page, like the faster this will go. So I might say like, hey, we need 10 iterations of this. And so now as I scroll, it's actually playing a lot faster. So depending on the length of your page, you can change that iteration count out, and that will be a solution there of actually being able to see your animation a little bit quicker, for example, as it loops through the cycle. And so there you go. I'm actually making this work. Now I could add a few other things to this just to clean it up. I'm sort of bothered by the terrible look of my text and the capitalization that's here. So I want to play with the fonts and all of that, but the basics here are working for us. But the one thing I could do is add an animation range to this. So beyond animation timeline, let's say I didn't necessarily want it have to go all the way down in order to animate across the page. What I might say that we'll have an animation range, and we could start at 0%, but like 50% of the way down the scroll bar, we'll have 100% of our animation done, basically. So as I scroll down, I only need to be about 50% down the scroll bar to have done the full animation. So you could time this out so it's like, you know, like you barely have to scroll to do the animation. Like let's say I said 20% here, not 200, just 20. And then when I scroll down, you'll see that quickly goes across the page and completes the full animation within 20% of my scrolling. And so that's kind of fun depending on how we do this. The one thing that's a little weird with that is that once you're done, it kind of snaps back to the beginning. So what I could do is say that we need animation fill mode, and I'm going to just say both, and then that means it's going to sort of not necessarily snap back like that. once it completes, it will just complete at its final destination, basically. Now, I do want this scrolling across the entirety of the timeline, and so I'll leave that there at an animation range of all the way across, and we'll see that that sort of animates all the way across as we go down. Now, 1,000 is a little bit bigger than this browser. If I was to move this over, though, we could see that we could hit like 1,000 pixels and it will finally kind of stop right there at 1,000. So you might have to adjust your if you're wanting to go all the way across the screen with something, you could adjust. Another way I could do this would be to think about it more like the viewport width. And so I go like 90 viewport width units or something like that. And then I go pretty much across the page, no matter what the, if I have a smaller width, it's still kind of doing that until I hit the sort of edge of the page, more or less. So that would be another way to do that, depending on your content here. Anyway, happy animating. There's a little introduction to animating a sprite sheet with pure CSS.